If you've been brewing long enough, chances are you've served it to friends and you've gotten some mixed reactions. Some like this. Ugh. Do you got like a Miller Lite or something? This is quite unpleasant. Are you trying to poison me or something? No, it's good. I like it. When you're really going for things like this. Whoa, like best beer ever. Oh, dude, you gotta fill a growler of this thing when I go. My girlfriend has to try it. Holy mother of Teresa, this is splendid. Wow, you actually made this? This is fantastic. Oh my God. Well, what if I told you, come closer, that your next batch of beer would be amazing? I'm gonna show you 3 ways how to do that. After you grab yourself a beer, hit that like and subscribe button, and we're gonna get after it. Also, do hit that like and subscribe button. It does help out the channel tremendously. Good day.
Number 1.
The very first thing you're gonna hear me say is temperature control. And I know what you're saying. You've probably heard me and others say this all the time on various videos, and I get it. That's because it's still the number 1 way that you can make better beer, period. The way I do it, and the way a lot of people do it, is by having a dedicated fermentation chamber, which is like this chest freezer behind me. I have a cold source, which is the chest freezer itself, and I also have a heat source in there, which we'll talk about in a second. And why a heat source, you ask? Well, that's because it's winter right now in January, and my garage gets colder than what that beer should be fermenting at. Like people, yeast have a favorite temperature that they like to either sleep at or be active at or whatever, right? And if you're outside of those ranges, they get, well, angry.
Keep on smiling. Oh, I said over easy!
And so they can give off those weird off flavors and other things in your beer that is going to make it taste terrible, or at least unpleasant. But that really depends on the yeast strain itself. There are some yeast strains like Kveik Yeast or others that like it at a hotter temperature, and so that fermentation temperature control is less important. But overall, for ales, they love to be in the mid-60s. I like to ferment specifically at about 67 degrees Fahrenheit. And for lagers, that could be in the lower 50s to mid-50s. But your beer can also get too cold. So what I use is a lizard lamp. It is a ceramic bulb inside of a housing that can plug into my Inkbird thermometer heat source, and that regulates the temperature up and down. So you don't need really expensive equipment like glycol chillers or other things in order to make fantastic beer. It could be something you already have in your garage, or you can get relatively inexpensive even used. And so if you have an old chest freezer sitting around, it's very easy without literally any other modifications to make that chest freezer into a fermentation chamber. And I'll have a video on how to do that in the video description below.
Number 2.
The second thing I see homebrewers do all of the time that they can prevent fairly easy is oxidation. So you may be tempted, especially as a new brewer, to see what's going on inside of your bucket or some other fermenter where you can't see what's really going on. So you kind of peek in the lid and you crack it and you really want to see what's happening in there, whether the krausen's really fallen or not. And that's okay to do sometimes, but what I would say is don't rush it. A lot of people rush their beers, and because of that, they can do several steps along the way too quickly and don't let their beer condition out. But especially cracking the lid, especially after fermentation has completely finished, can let oxygen in and can oxidize your beer. But most of the time this happens is because you're transferring from one vessel to another. And so in earlier stages of my brewing career, and even when I first started this channel, I used secondary fermenters all the time. It's not really secondary fermentation because that's usually already happened, but it's a secondary vessel nonetheless. So I still use those depending on which beer I'm brewing. So in some cases they're still necessary, but in 99% of cases, it's really not. You can leave your beer in a primary fermenter until you're ready to rack it into a bottling bucket or into the keg. Now when you're doing that, you should make sure you're absolutely doing that as slowly and as methodically as you can. I would even try and purge a bucket or a keg if you can with CO2, even if it's a little bit at the bottom, because as you're racking that into that other vessel, there's going to be a little bit of swirling around of that beer. And as long as you're not splashing it around a lot, it shouldn't really have that big of an effect on your beer. However, the ways you can limit that is by purging that vessel with a little bit of CO2, kind of creating a little bit of a CO2 blanket in order to prevent as much oxidation as you can. Another great way that I've just recently started doing over the past year or two is adding ascorbic acid into your mash. And this is really important for those that are very susceptible to oxidation. So any pale ales, IPAs, English bitters, and especially hazy IPAs. Those in particular are very susceptible to oxidation. They're lighter color beers and they can get that oxidation off flavor that kind of tastes like cardboardy flavor a lot easier. And so what I do to prevent that is add 4 grams of ascorbic acid into your mash. Right when you're mashing in, no matter which process that you use, it's all the same. That's gonna help scrub out any oxygen that gets into there and help prevent those off flavors before they start. Another thing that people do is they open up their fermenter in order to dry hop their beer. Very, very common for pale ales, for IPAs, and especially hazy IPAs, depending on when you're dry hopping, right? And so what I like to do is use Sous Vide Magnets, and I attach a couple of them inside of a hop bag, which is basically a small paint strainer bag, and I put the other 2 on the outside of my fermenter. Then when I'm ready to dry hop, no matter whether that's high Krausen for a hazy IPA, or maybe it's completely after fermentation like I just did for my Celebration Ale, you go ahead and you pull those magnets off the side, the hops drop in, the magnets that are inside of the bag help kind of drop that those hops into the beer and help them get them submerged. But the whole time that fermentation's been going on, it's been purging those hops of oxygen. So there's no reason to open your lid whatsoever. Another way that people get oxidation in their beer is by cold crashing. So cold crashing just drops the temperature of your beer, but by doing that it creates a vacuum inside of your fermentation vessel, and sometimes it can suck the star sand from your airlock out and let oxygen in that can mix with some of the CO2 and also get oxidation of your beer. So to combat that, I use what we call a cold crash guardian. You can either purchase that, there's a link in the video description I'll have for you, or you can make your own. There's a DIY video also down there, especially if you live outside of the United States and you can't get one shipped to you. Essentially, the cold crash guardian fills a bag with CO2 from fermentation, and then when you're cold crashing, allows it to suck back some of that CO2 into your vessel in order to prevent oxidation. Cold crashing is important in order to drop some of those hop particulates or proteins out of the beer and clarify your beer before you transfer it either to your bottling bucket or to a keg.
Number 3.
Number 3, and certainly last but not least, is water. Your beer is over 90% water, probably the most important ingredient that you have in your beer. You put a lot of time and effort into your recipe, into the brew day, so why wouldn't you want to make sure that main ingredient isn't the best it can absolutely be to make great beer? And once you know how to adjust your water, both by adding water additions and by adjusting the pH, you can do that in about 5 minutes. Think about it like making a cake. You wouldn't substitute flour or change flour or use a less inferior flour in order to make a cake. You'd want to use the best ingredients in order to make the best cake that you can. Same with beer. And I have a video on how to do all of that stuff in the link description below. It's going to show you how to find a water report, how to change your pH, and how to add simple salt additions for just a few pennies. That's going to help make sure your water is specific to your recipe and making sure that you hit the ground running with your number 1 ingredient in beer, water. So if you just change those 3 things that we just talked about, you're gonna make better beer. And that's gonna take your beer from this, I wouldn't be serving this to my worst nightmare. Good day, sir. To this, bro, you must teach me the ways. So as always, hit that like and subscribe button. Leave any questions, comments in the video description below. Happy brewing, and cheers. I said good day, sir.
Hey,
Thanks for watching my video. I really do appreciate it. A way you can support the channel is just by buying me a beer. There's a button right there on the screen, and there's a link in the video description below. You can also check out the merchandise in our store, and you can hit the video on the screen right now. You know you want to.